Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos. Welcome to MALDEF's 2014 Latino State of the State in Arizona. This is a live webcast from the Arizona History Museum in this beautiful city of Tucson, Arizona. To those of you in our studio audience, I welcome all of you, and also to each of you watching us throughout the United States and beyond, also many thanks. This is MALDEF's 2014 Latino State of the State, Arizona. It's a discussion on law, on policy, and on civil rights. My name is Jose Ronstadt. A lot of you I've had the pleasure of knowing for many, many years. Welcome to all the members of the Tucson International Mariachi Conference that are here, to some of our friends, journalists, family members, and all the ones that are supportive of MALDEF. I anchor the news in Los Angeles on a daily basis, but I'm actually from Arizona, born in the beautiful capital that is the metropolis of Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. I'll be your moderator today for today's discussion. We're very proud to be here with each one of you. We're going to try to keep this discussion centered on Latino issues, the Latino issues that impact the forefront of the state of Arizona. The Latino State of the State also gives us an opportunity to focus on ways in which Arizona's public policy has affected and continues to affect the Latino community, not just in this state, but also throughout the nation. Today's event allows us to collectively discuss and advocate for critical policies that facilitate a better quality of life for Latinos in Arizona and throughout the country, now and also in the near future for generations of Latinos. Founded in 1968, MALDEF is the nation's leading Latino legal civil rights organization, known as the Latino Legal Voice for Civil Rights in America. MALDEF promotes social change through advocacy, communication, community education, and litigation in the areas of education, employment, immigrant rights, and political access. Now I would like to introduce to you MALDEF's President and General Counsel, Thomas A. Saenz. Thomas is a nationally recognized civil rights leader. He returned to MALDEF in the year 2009 as President and General Counsel after, I believe, almost 4 years being away as he was serving the city of Los Angeles in the mayor's office. His commitment to serving the Latino community and his strength of leadership has been demonstrated inside the courtroom with his key role in significant civil rights cases over the last 20 years. Outside the courtroom, his candid and incisive leadership on key national issues like immigration reform, like educational equality, and voting rights is also well known and well documented. Thus far in his tenure, as MALDEF's leader, Tom has increased the number of lawsuits MALDEF has filed and led the organization on pivotal legal victories that protect the rights of Latinos. This year, Mr. Saenz was named one of the 50 most influential nonprofit leaders in the United States by the nonprofit Times Magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, vamos a darle bienvenido, un fuerte aplauso. Please welcome MALDEF's President and General Counsel, Thomas A. Saenz. Thomas, as most of you know. Thomas?
Thank you, Jose, and welcome all of you to this 2014 Latino State of the State discussion here in Tucson, Arizona. We held a similar event discussing the Latino State of the State for Arizona a little over 2 years ago. It turned out to be an auspicious date we had chosen months in advance, but we met together in Phoenix and had a discussion like this one only a day or so after the United States Supreme Court in June of 2012 struck down the bulk of SB 1070 that was being considered before it. That was an appropriate way to begin that discussion, and we begin this discussion looking back 2 years ago. Now, that was a time, with the Supreme Court ruling on SB 1070, that Arizona and its leaders had thrust themselves to the center of the national discourse about the critical issue of immigration and the need for immigration reform. Here, 2 years later, we still have that screaming need for immigration reform. But perhaps because of continued court defeats, although, of course, the notorious Section 2B of SB 1070 is still in litigation, but after numerous court defeats, including that Supreme Court defeat with respect to SB 1070, including a year ago in June, a defeat of the requirement in Arizona imposed by Prop 200 that would have required new voter registrants to prove that they were United States citizens. Continued defeats in court for the notorious Sheriff Joe Arpaio. And most recently, something that I know we'll talk about later this afternoon, a defeat for the state of Arizona and its governor in her attempt to deny driver's licenses despite a long history of providing them to recipients of deferred action, specifically to those who received the DACA program. And so this is a different Arizona. Again, perhaps because of those court defeats, Arizona is no longer the center of the discussion about the critical issue of immigration, is no longer, perhaps, the center of the discussion of how this nation will adjust, how this nation will move forward and thrive in a changing demographic community. We also know that here in Arizona, change continues, particularly because of the results of the primary election a few weeks ago. We know that very shortly, after the November elections, there will be a new governor in Arizona, a new Secretary of State in Arizona, a new Attorney General in Arizona, a new Superintendent of Public Instruction in Arizona. And so for Arizona, like 2 years ago, this is an auspicious time to have this discussion. The question in this time of transition, though, is how deep and transformative will this time of change be? Can Arizona transform itself from being, beginning 4 years ago with the enactment of SB 1070, beginning 4 years ago with the statewide legislation that targeted a successful Mexican-American studies program here in Tucson? Can Arizona turn from being the center of division, from being a leader in the anti-immigrant sentiment, from being a leader in the defiance of our constitutional guarantees, including the guarantee that we as a nation will have only one immigration policy? Can Arizona turn from that notoriety to become a model, instead, in this time of transition, of how to embrace the new Arizona, the new United States, and ensure that we move forward together toward progress? You may ask why, 2 years later, we're not once again in Phoenix, where there will again be new statewide officials taking office after November. Why are we in Tucson? It's because there is an opportunity, particularly here in Tucson, to take a lead not only for the state of Arizona, but for the entire nation. And it relates squarely with another auspicious anniversary this year in 2014. Some 60 years ago, the United States Supreme Court made two critical decisions, both of them unanimously, both of them in May, both of them separated in their announcement by mere days. The first you no doubt have all heard of, Brown versus Board of Education, the United States Supreme Court's unanimous decision rejecting Jim Crow segregation in schools and concluding that under our Constitution, there can be no mandated racial separation in our schooling. The other case is not so well known, but for an occasion like this should be recalled. That case was a case called Hernandez versus Texas, a case in which the state of Texas has sought to evade previously established rules regarding the exclusion of minorities from juries with respect to the Latino community by artfully concluding that Mexican Americans who had for years and years been characterized as a separate race should be considered white. And by doing that, the state of Texas sought to evade rules that had been applied decades before in addressing African American jury exclusion. Texas' argument was, well, this is not an exclusion because after all, Mexican Americans are white. Everybody on the jury is white. So no Mexican American defendant can complain that they're not represented on the jury. Of course, none of those white jurors were Mexican American. That was the longstanding pattern. And in fact, that evasion was rejected 60 years ago by the United States Supreme Court unanimously. Basically concluded in perhaps the most important Supreme Court decision addressing the Latino community and its civil rights, concluding that the state of Texas could not so easily evade the Constitution. That in fact its longstanding pattern of exclusion of Mexican Americans from juries had to fall. Again, you might ask yourself, how did those two 60-year anniversaries dictate that we would be here in Tucson for this important discussion? Well, of course, those two cases were not about what they are too often superficially described as. Brown versus Board of Education was not so much about segregation as it was about equal educational opportunity. Just as Hernandez versus Texas was not so much about having the right to serve on a jury, goodness knows many people would prefer to forego that right of serving on a jury. In fact, it was about ensuring equal justice and due process in our criminal system. Similarly, here in Tucson, in one of MALDEF's oldest cases, if not its oldest case, there is an opportunity through the implementation of a unitary status plan, a decree in court governing the necessity of complying with the desegregation mandate of Brown in Tucson Unified School District. Now, of course, we had seen desegregation cases on behalf of the Latino community even prior to Brown, the very famous Mendez case out of Orange County, California. Here, it's not Mendez, but it's Mendoza, a case where MALDEF, together with others, have represented the community in trying to ensure that the Tucson Unified School District will eliminate the vestiges of discrimination and segregation that still inhere in the system. But the unitary status plan recently put in place is an opportunity for us all to work cooperatively and collaboratively to achieve that transition that I described earlier. We have an opportunity through the USP to ensure that equal educational opportunity becomes a reality, that we eliminate the vestiges of segregation and integrate the schools. But of course, it's not only about integration, particularly not superficial integration. It's about equal educational opportunity, and that is a deeper integration in our schools. For example, it would be a meaningless integration if any school system were to ensure that children were integrated, the races were integrated in a school, but then assigned all of the English learners to a program that was a dead end, that kept them mired in learning English and never brought them to academic fluency, such that they could never actually integrate fully with their peers. That would be a false integration. It would be a false integration if any school system were to integrate children at a school, but once in the school, were to track the minority kids into a particular set of courses and keep them out of, or in very small numbers, in the advanced learning opportunities, the AP courses, the IB courses, the advanced opportunities, the gifted programs, the chance to thrive and succeed at the highest level. That too would be a false integration. But we have an opportunity together here in Tucson to have a deeper integration, one that achieves true equal educational opportunity for all. And through that process of deeper collaboration to reach that deeper integration and true equal educational opportunity is another opportunity, the chance to lead. The chance for Tucson not just to be the lead in Arizona, but the lead nationwide in tackling and reducing the achievement gap, in tackling and reducing the segregation that inheres not just in our schools, but because of what happens in our schools and that achievement gap in occupations and leadership throughout life. This city and this state can be a model, can turn from what it was 4 years ago, an example of intolerance and anti-immigrant nativism, and become an example of integration, deep integration, and equal opportunity. And that's what launching this discussion today is about. But it's critical to note as I conclude my remarks that in fact, this is not so much a turning away from the real Arizona, but a turning back to the real Arizona. When I introduced this program 2 years ago, I pointed out that my family's own American dream began in Arizona, when my maternal grandparents immigrated from 2 different countries, met here in Arizona, and began their family, including my mother. Arizona is the roots of so many American dreams that it can be that again in the future. It's also auspicious that we are here at the Arizona History Museum because it reminds us that Arizona history is not in 2010. Its history is not in SB 1070. Its history is deeper and longer and includes critical elements of deep integration. Indeed, this state had a Latino governor, Tucsonian Raul Castro, in 1975. There are a number of states that now, nearly 40 years later, cannot claim that achievement. So this moment of transition is a transition for Arizona to become once again, as it has historically, a leader in achieving deep integration and equal opportunity for all. With those remarks, I look forward to our deeper discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. You went over 2 minutes. We're pleased you met some of our panel members today. Again, we want to say thanks to each one of you. We're pleased to have with us Dr. M. Beatriz Arias, Vice President of the Center for Applied Linguistics. Dr. Arias is an expert in training teachers on how to work with English language learners and is often called to serve as a court-appointed expert in school desegregation cases, not just here in Arizona, but across the nation. Vamos a darle un fuerte aplauso.
Thank you.
Next, we have Dulce Matus, President of the Arizona Dream Act Coalition, a youth-led immigrants' rights organization. Dulce is well documented as a super champion for other dreamers, promoting a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, for undocumented students who were brought to the United States as kids, as children. She has been named one of Times Magazine's 100 most influential people. So it's a pleasure seeing you again. Francisco Heredia is the director of One Arizona, a nonpartisan coalition of 12 diverse nonprofit organizations across the state seeking to increase Latino civic participation. Francisco brings more than a decade of experience working in the nonprofit sector, state and federal government, and also in the political arena. Bienvenido, gracias. Lois D. Thompson is a partner at the law firm of Proskauer, Rose LLP. Her litigation experience includes securities, antitrust, complex real estate and construction, intellectual property matters, as well as employment law litigation. Before joining her firm, she served as Assistant General Counsel of Suburban Action Institute, where she litigated federal and state lawsuits regarding access to affordable housing. Lewis has been a partner with MALDEF in working towards full implementation of the school desegregation decree here in Tucson that Tom mentioned in his speech. And finally, you already met the men, Thomas Sines, the President and General Counsel of MALDEF, whom we heard earlier, and we're going to put you on the spot, hopefully, during this discussion. To all of you again, once again, thanks for joining us. And let's begin this with the immigration issue that continues to draw a lot of attention across the nation, specifically here in Arizona. Dulce, the question is for you. How important is the so-called administrative relief that President Obama has promised to a state like Arizona?
Back in 2008, President Barack Obama made a promise to the Latino community that when elected, he will pass immigration reform in the first 100 days. That, 6 years later, hasn't happened. A few weeks ago, he made a second promise that if Congress failed to act and failed to pass immigration reform, he was going to use his executive power to expand deferred action by the end of the summer. The end of the summer is almost here. And every day that Obama does not act, we're going to continue experiencing 1,100 deportations. We're going to continue seeing family separation. Today, we have 4.5 million children that live in mixed status families that have at least one undocumented parent. We're going to see children like Ardani's citizen children that have been separated from him because he's been in detention for over a year. We're going to see cases like Marichui, a transgender woman who has been raped and is currently in detention. We're going to continue seeing cases of here in Arizona of undocumented people that are being criminalized because they're bringing bread to their family. We're going to continue seeing the raids, and we're going to continue seeing the pain in our communities. So it is very important, not just because it's the morally right decision, but because it's the economically right decision for America. If deferred action is expanded, we're going to see an increase of tax revenue of $45 billion in the next 5 years. We're going to be able to see families and people coming out of the shadows and being integrated into our communities.
Thank you, Dulce. Tom, we hear the buzzword defer action, and for the benefit of some of the people that might be here that have never heard the term or confused the term with executive order or confused it with something else, briefly define what it is and how it impacts.
Sure, Jose. Deferred action, which the president implemented 2 years ago for childhood arrivals, the DREAM, is basically an exercise of presidential discretion as the chief executive of the country to provide protections to those who are otherwise undocumented. So basically it's a process where folks apply and they receive deferred action, and if they can demonstrate the need, they also get work authorization. It provides protection to them, if you will, a guarantee that the fact that they're undocumented alone will not put them in harm's way, will not put them at risk of being one of those 1,100 who are deported on a daily basis, as Dulce described. So it is an exercise of presidential discretion, consistent with his duties to enforce immigration law, which always involves discretion, to ensure that there are protections given, guarantees given, and rights to work given, that in turn ensure that those folks can work with all the protections of the law.
Thank you, Tom. You know, it's been almost 2 years since most pundits almost universally identified that this problem of immigration, the significance of it, and they said immigration has a direct correlation to how people voted in the presidential election, and they attributed the Latino turnout and also the hugeness, the big amount of the votes that the president got to the immigration issue. With that in mind, Francisco, what impact will the House's failure to act on immigration reform legislation have in the upcoming midterm elections?
Yeah, no, I think, after the 2012 elections, we saw, week after the congressional members positioning themselves where before the election was the rhetoric that was being used was anti-immigrant. Right after they saw the increased growth in the Latino electorate, over 11 million nationwide came out to vote, the largest ever. We saw that swift change. So the inaction of immigration reform by our Congress really not only has the human cost that Dulce mentioned about the deportation, the separation of families, but on the political side, I think we, here, especially in Arizona, we see, tremendous demotivation, I think, with Latinos, especially when we do door-to-door, going door-to-door, talking to our community. I think, promises were made, and I think we had the largest coalition for an issue, business community, the grassroots community, pushing Congress to pass. We got it passed in the Senate, in the House. It wasn't brought to a vote, and I really think if it was brought to a vote, it would have passed. But this inaction has really caused some mixed feelings in our community about, why are we electing, these members of Congress? What are they doing in Washington? So, for us, it's a reality of this inaction is causing some, I think, demotivation. But we're still working hard to ensure that folks, are voting in every election, so that we build that political power in our community to really keep those individuals accountable for their actions. And these midterm elections are important for that, to really maintain that political power moving forward, to keep them accountable.
And hopefully we can come back to see how is that going to be reflected in terms of the votes that actually go and people that actually go and cast a vote, because on midterm elections we have less folks. Tom, what about the president's reporting reluctance to implement the promised affirmative relief that was mentioned earlier? How is that going to affect, in your view, the election outcomes?
Well, it's extremely troubling. As you have suggested, reports have come out recently that President Obama intends to wait potentially until after the election to announce a program of prosecutorial discretion and deferred action to protect those immigrants who have been here contributing over years, in some cases decades, to our communities, to our families, to the growth of our country, and who are left every day without that critical protection, that exercise of prosecutorial discretion. Now, it's hard to predict what the effect would be on the election, because on the other hand, we also have a Congress that is apparently incapable of acting because it's increasingly polarized and has not taken the steps necessary to put in place a legislative solution, which would be a more or less permanent solution to the issue. Well, administrative action, administrative relief, deferred action is by definition temporary. Nonetheless, it's very troubling and something that we should all be sure that the president understands, that this is an urgent issue. Our country needs protection for those immigrants yesterday, not after the election.
Thank you, Tom. One effect that's seemingly everywhere across the country of the immigration issue is the growing number of English language learners throughout our public school systems. And this question is for Beatriz. What has the impact been of an increasing English learner student body, not just in the state of Arizona, but also in your personal experience? And really, how do you measure? What is the appropriate way to measure success?
Thank you, Jose. I'd like to thank MALDEF and Tom for inviting me to be here for this very important discussion. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a very large increase in the English language learner population across the country. There are about 5 million English learners now in every state. So every state across the country has students who identify as English language learners. And every state then has to provide some appropriate educational response. It's also 40 years after the Lau decision, the Lau v. Nichols decision, which ruled that providing the same services to children was not necessarily equal education. You had to provide services that the students needed. Just providing them with the same books and the same teachers as non-English learners was not equitable. And so it refined our understanding of what equity is. And so, like all children, English learners should be held to the same standard as all students. We want all English learners can succeed and achieve the same rate at the same level as non-English learners. And that is our goal, to make sure that we have the right teachers, that we have the right materials, that we have the right assessment systems, and that school districts across the country are meeting the needs of those students.
So you have all these tools, but how do you measure success, which is the second part of my question?
And you can measure success with the same tools, the same tests that are being used to measure the success of fluent English speakers. The point being that our English language learners need supports, scaffolding, special services, special programs in order to be able to achieve as well as fluent English speakers. So the assessment systems are there, but we have to engage our parents, our communities, and our teachers and to address the needs of the students.
So the tools are there, the mechanisms now are the responsibility of our parents, our communities, of our leaders.
Well, yes, Jose, but there are states that are different. And so Arizona is one of the states that has a very restrictive language policy. And so we don't allow, since the voter initiative in 2002, to teach students in their native language. We are restrictive. Other states don't do that. Texas doesn't do that. Illinois doesn't do that. They provide bilingual services as long as students need them. And so we then cripple our English learners by insisting that we have a model that is not research-based to teach our English learners and segregate them, as Tom was saying earlier in his introductory remarks, that our English learners are segregated in their classrooms, in their schools, from other English speakers.
Muy bien, gracias. Tom spoke, as you mentioned earlier, of the Tucson desegregation case and the Unitary Status Plan, known as USP, that seeks to eliminate the effects of past segregation and equal educational opportunity in the city of Tucson. Luis, you know this case, and you know the plan as well as anyone. How important are the issues of English learning education in the so-called USP plan, and how does it promote better outcomes?
English language learners are referenced throughout the Unitary Status Plan. throughout the plan, if you were to look at it, it talks about providing particular opportunities to African American and Latino students, including the English language learning students, so that it is central to the plan. And one of the issues that we've had recently is that, and this is in a sense building on something that Beatrice said, that which is measured is done. That which is not measured gets lost. And we have been urging the district to actually look at goal setting for the English language learners, just as it is looking at goal setting more broadly for the class of African American plaintiffs and the class of Latino plaintiffs. Because we came into the negotiation of the USP with a set of statistics that are also attached to the Unitary Status Plan that tell us, not surprisingly, but heart-wrenchingly, of the lower graduation rates of ELL students from high school, of the lesser participation in the courses that would actually have additional rigor. So that it's very important that we really focus on, provide the opportunities for, and keep reporting on the progress of the English language learners so that they don't continue to be lost.
Just briefly on what you mentioned, you mentioned negotiation. That means that there's opposition to it. So who do you negotiate with, and what do you negotiate?
We're in a litigation, so by definition there is opposition. But in fact, one of the strengths, I believe, of the Unitary Status Plan is that it is a consent decree, which meant that the plaintiffs, the United States government, and the Tucson School District agreed to it. There have been disputes along the way about how to implement it, but some negotiations result in agreement, and we begin with a consent agreement.
Thomas, you want to briefly add something?
Yeah, I think Lois is of course correct. It is litigation, but it is litigation at a stage that should be cooperative and collaborative, and I think by and large that's how you ensure success, where there is a community understanding that the entire community is invested in success, is invested in ensuring that every child in Tucson receives an integrated education. Every child, regardless of race, regardless of English learner status, has an opportunity to succeed at the highest level. And that really means working together, taking the model of opposition that too often prevails in litigation and recognizing we are at a different stage, implementing together a consent decree. And cooperatively is how we reach really ensuring that Tucson is a model.
Beatriz, let me get back to you. What have you seen in Tucson in terms of the impact of Arizona's language policies? I know you briefly touched upon it, but specifically the adoption over 10 years ago of the so-called structured immersion models for English learners.
Well, I was part of a group of professors from universities across the Southwest, UCLA, University of Arizona, Arizona State University, and we studied school districts across Arizona that were implementing structured English immersion. Structured English immersion is the model that Arizona requires for English learners to acquire English. But it is not research-based, and we tried to convince the State Board of Education it was not research-based, and we were not successful. So what it requires is that you isolate English learners in classes for 4 hours a day. Now, you have 6 hours a day of school, so 4 hours a day, the larger part of the day, English learners spend with other English learners. And they never get to associate, well, for a little while, perhaps during lunch and recess, with other models, peer models who speak English. That's one part. But another part is the fact that they aren't getting content area instruction during those 4 hours. So what are they missing out on? They're missing out on their math and their social studies and other content areas, which further aggravates the achievement issue, the achievement gap. And so in Arizona, I hope that we can transform our current state law as they're trying to do in California, because this English-only policy is creating more barriers and more restrictions on the achievement of English learners.
You've heard Tom talk about Arizona's long history of English-only policies and movements in and out of education. Francisco, the English-only movement is still a major political factor in Arizona. And the question is, what is the best way, to respond to that? And I can go back in Arizona to the Hannigan case, and since then, it seems to be that it's always something else in the state of Arizona.
Definitely, I think it's the political force maybe has cooled down from past years, and it's really intense. I think we see it a lot on the political end with the rhetoric, and there's a definitely underbelly with a lot of people using English as you need to learn English, you need to immerse as soon as possible. Definitely in the immigration debate, we see that a lot more. In the issue of the English language learners, definitely when it seems like every few years there's court decisions after the court decisions, and that gets bring back up. And in the state legislature, we haven't seen in the last few years, we haven't seen that emphasis on English language as being a political force. But I think it gets brought up on specific issues, especially immigration.
So is it just a matter of electing the right type of officials when Maricopa County, for example, controls 60% of the vote in Arizona, if I'm correctly, and they keep on electing Joe Arpaio? So how do you fight that? How do you counter that?
Yeah, no, I think it's informing the public about these public officials, what they're doing at the state legislature or county perches that there are. So it's definitely an education. I think of my voter mobilization experience is definitely to inform the public to know about who our representatives are and what kind of policies are they passing. Because elections for us, it's only a means. The policy for us is the end, to get good policies that support our schools, that pass immigration reform, that support the economic vibrant of our communities in our state.
Tom, you talk about deeper integration. Is it possible when a small amount of voters control who gets elected, specifically in the state of Arizona?
Well, it is possible, but it's made ever more easy if you ensure that more people participate. And I think that's got to be the number one goal of everyone who would like to see a different Arizona and a different nation. We have to ensure that Latinos vote, that those who are allies with the Latino community, who recognize our common interests across communities, who recognize that the real Arizona is a bilingual, bicultural Arizona, that the English-only Arizona of the last several decades is a false Arizona. I think that when we work together to realize common mission, that encourages participation, and participation, conversely, encourages a recognition of that common mission. So the most important thing that can happen in the next 2 months here and across the country is that folks turn out in the same way they did 2 years ago. Just because there isn't a president on the ballot doesn't mean that anybody should stay home. And we all have to work together to make sure that that turnout is maximized.
In some ways, English-only politics have been eclipsed by other anti-immigrant politics in Arizona in recent years. One significant example was the legislation 4 years ago targeting ethnic studies. And you know who I'm asking this question to. Luis, that legislation was specifically aimed at a successful Mexican-American studies program here in the city of Tucson, Arizona. How has the USP program, the plan, addressed that issue? And has the Tucson Unified School District re-implemented an ethnic studies program that you can say it's legitimate?
The Unitary Status Plan does address the ethnic studies programs, calling them culturally responsive pedagogy and culturally responsive curriculum. And what we had sought when we were going forward with the plan was a commitment to put together a vibrant, exciting set of courses that would attract students, that would help them on their successful completion of their school and move them on to college. And unfortunately, what we have found are a number of bumps along the way. The process has been extraordinarily slow. It took us a long time, frankly, to convince the district that it ought to have a separate director, as we believed was required by the Unitary Status Plan, to actually deal with what I'll call, for shorthand purposes, the ethnic studies classes. And there is express language in the Unitary Status Plan that says that these courses were to have been offered at every Tucson high school last year, 2 years ago, the 13-14 year. That did not happen. That's last year. It happened only at 3 schools. And we accepted that accepted it reluctantly, because we understood that the district had been having difficulty putting the curriculum together and maintained that it was having difficulty attracting and training the teachers. Unfortunately, we are making close to no progress this year, where 25 sections of these courses were offered last year. Only 30 sections of the courses are being offered this year. And it's in 3 high schools, and it's expanded more or less to another 2 schools, but it's certainly not in all of the high schools. And by this year, there was supposed to have been an effort to expand the program into the middle schools, and that, frankly, is not yet happening. We're being told the curriculum is being worked on, but the students are not yet experiencing it.
Is there any hope?
I never give up hope, but I am quite concerned.
Tom, how important is it for Latinos nationally to ensure a strong, vigorous response to Arizona's attempt to eliminate ethnic studies?
I think it's critical. I think that it is a manifestation of an anti-Latino sentiment in legislation that is extraordinary. Let's pause for a moment and consider how extraordinary that legislation was. It was not at all about pedagogy. It was not at all about educational success, because the program that was targeted was a successful program. It was not at all about community relations. Indeed, while it purported to target courses that it viewed as, well, we shouldn't say it, that certain officials, soon to be no longer officials, viewed as divisive. The applause is for Arizona for accomplishing a change. But it was portrayed as divisive courses when in fact the legislation is what dealt a serious blow to community relations, because it somehow conveyed to people that having students understand the full scope of history, the full scope of literature, the full scope of every possible discipline was somehow divisive. And that is extraordinary. Equally extraordinary was that it targeted a particular program in a particular district. So it's critically important to push back on that kind of extraordinary legislative betrayal. And it's critical then, I believe, that Tucson take the opportunity that's been given through the USB, a federal court order, a consent decree that is signed off by a federal judge and therefore overrides that state legislation. It's critical to take that opportunity and fully implement these courses to demonstrate that they can be a strong pedagogical tool and a strong community relations tool.
Dulce, this is the most quiet I've ever seen Dulce in my life. Dulce, Tom just mentioned this history in Arizona of seeking to basically, and I quote, buck the progressive trend and go backwards as the rest of the country goes forward. Another example lies in Arizona's reaction to the highly successful DACA program, which we all know has been very effective, has been embraced by thousands of kids, throughout the nation. How has Arizona responded to this, to the program?
Well, when you live in the most anti-immigrant state and you have extremist politicians, you don't get to celebrate your victories. Back in August 15 of 2012, marked a very historic day for our movement, because it was supposed to be the first day that we were going to be fully integrated into this nation, into this state, by being able to have that employment authorization and process your social security number. Yet again, we saw Governor Jan Brewer's actions by issuing an executive order that said, even though that you're allowed to stay here in the United States, even though that you have an employment authorization, you don't have the right or the privilege to drive. So she did that. And thanks to MALDEF, NILC, and the ACLU, along with the Arizona Dream Out Coalition, we filed a lawsuit that a few weeks ago, we saw a very successful 3-judge panel unanimous decision saying that Brewer's actions are irrational, they are unconstitutional, and are also very expensive. She has misspent taxpayers' dollars over $700,000 on a very irrational argument by violating the constitutional rights of DACA recipients. And the only 2 states that are doing this are Arizona and Nebraska. So I think that we have a very good opportunity to be able to change this history by electing pro-immigrant candidates that are going to treat deferred action applicants fairly, and also, hopefully very soon, when DACA expansion happens, this is going to be prevented.
Muy bien. By the way, don't worry about the lights. This is part of normal television. We do this in the studio all the time, and you know the old saying, the show just keeps on going. Let me, Tom talked earlier about the fact that deferred action is temporary. Are you concerned? This president's going to go out. Are you concerned that this might just go away?
Even if it goes away, not having DACA, it's a risk every day. When students are going to school, when our parents are going to work, when we go to church, when we go to the grocery store, we are at risk. So we rather have a protection that is temporary and that is going to allow us to come out of the shadows, and we're going to be integrated and be able to talk to our friends and be able to get better jobs, better education, and be able to fulfill that American dream. Yes, we're willing to take that chance, but we're not willing to do is to continue seeing the deportation machine and having a dysfunctional Congress that doesn't get anything done, and yet we're going to continue being discriminated and alienated and deported every day.
Francisco, in terms of this stubborn refusal to accept national trends, you have an example from the voting area. How has Arizona responded to the United States Supreme Court decision a year ago striking down its proof of citizenship requirement that Tom talked about earlier for new voter registrants? What can Arizona people do about this?
Yeah, I think how Arizona's responded is not that well. I think Attorney General Horn issued an opinion, an ordinance to create a 2-tier track system of using the federal form and the state form according to voter registration. So what he did is basically created 2 classes of voters here in this state. And there's definitely litigation going on, and we worked with MALDEF and other organizations nationally to really push on this. What it basically does, if a student or somebody uses the federal form and they can't be matched on the on MVD or Social Security database that the county recorders match voters with, they are put on a federal elections only ballot where this midterm year they will only vote for Congress. They're a Congress member, and they will not vote for any statewide officials, any local elections, representatives. So it's very concerning for us to see this opinion by the Attorney General. And again, we're fighting with litigation, and hopefully we can have a stay after the deadline of October 6th when folks have to register to participate in the midterms here. So hopefully everybody will get a statewide election ballot, including members of Congress and state officials that they will vote for. But we are fighting our best and making sure folks are turning in the required identifications to be registered in the rolls here in Arizona.
So we've heard it. We have this regrettable stubborn resistance by state leaders to change to change the law? Do we have a change, to change demographically? Is there a local example that we can talk about this, Tom, Louis, anyone that can say, look, this can change?
Well, I think the example is one that we've talked about. There is an opportunity here in Tucson to really ensure that there is a model of community collaboration to achieve equal opportunity for everyone. It really is creating a different community that strives together and understands its common interest in achieving equal opportunity for all, and understands that integrating the immigrant community into every element of the community is critically important as well. There is an opportunity. It is an opportunity not just to be a model for the state, but for the country.
Louis, the Tucson desegregation case, as we heard, began 40 years ago and still exists today. Have you seen resistance to the case decree? Is there resistance also to any other type of plan, any other type of litigation that you guys are proposing?
Well, focusing on the consent decree, again, it began as a consent decree. That said, I have to say that I think there has been resistance. It's not easy to have a federal court judge, and in this case also a special master, functioning as the United States Constitution requires that they function, to oversee a school district which has its daily work to do as well as its constitutional obligations. So it presents a challenge. The thing that concerns me probably more than anything else is that I perceive an approach to the unitary status plan that is not so much resistance in the classic sense of resistance as a pattern of looking for ways to set standards, set goals, set targets that the special master in a recent report to the court called embarrassingly low. As an example, with respect to the GATE program in the city, the proposal by the district is to increase the number of Latino students in GATE programs by 1.5% from about 48% to about 49.5% of the total GATE population in 5 years. And I have to tell you, I look at that and I say, surely we together can want to do better than that.
Beatriz, the question is for you. What have you seen in your experience with the Tucson School District in the desegregation case? Is that typical in your experience of other desegregation cases?
School desegregation cases where Latino students are plaintiffs are really interesting in that because case law is built on precedent, the kind of remedies that judges feel comfortable with accepting have to have a lot of previous court cases that set the standard. And so when we have Latino students as plaintiffs, we need to be advocates for the kinds of programs that English language learners, that Latino students need, like Mexican American studies, like access. And so the opportunity of a consent decree is that it starts to try to set standards to create a much more equitable education. Access is key. Access to gifted and talented programs, access to advanced placement programs, access to honors programs, access to dual language programs. I would like to see our Latino students seen as assets across the state and start to recognize that we bring language and cultural backgrounds that everybody can benefit from. We all know that being bilingual is an asset in this global world. And our students bring the possibility of bilingualism to the district, to the state. And Arizona will be a global participant in the global marketplace if we have more bilingual professionals. And so it's in our state interest, in our economic interest, to look at our students, the Latinos that are here, who are English learners as assets, not in a deficit model, but as ways to build dual language programs. Everybody knows that the bilingual brain is smarter than the monolingual brain. And people will pay to send their kids to schools that will do that.
Thank you.
So this is what is an opportunity when you have a consent decree and that you're trying to level the playing field, improve educational opportunity, improve access for all kids.
Thank you, Beatrice. Tom, MALDEF has a long history of involvement in education, in educational equality cases. How important, and you mentioned this and underlined this, how important is the Tucson case in terms of the national effort towards closing the so-called achievement gap?
Well, I think it's critically important because it's a potential example to be used across the country of how you can embrace a goal, set of goals around equal educational opportunity and student integration and work together as a community to implement them successfully. I think that's a model that has to be embraced across the country. Regrettably, we have a system of education that provides a great degree of power to officials who are elected, and these are officials who make a commitment to serve as school board members, but they're elected through a system that unfortunately doesn't include a lot of the parents of Latino students, doesn't include, therefore, a lot of the Latino community. Whether that's because those parents are not citizens and cannot vote and therefore have no way to participate in the election of those school board members, or they simply are so stretched financially with taking care of their families that they don't have an opportunity, even if they are able to go and check a box on election day, they don't have an opportunity to become integrally involved in those campaigns, in that decision making. So we really have to adopt a model nationwide as the Latino community grows and recognize that it is growing across the country. Somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 students nationwide in public schools is Latino today. And if you look at the demographics of preschool-aged children, that proportion is going to increase even more in the future. So we really have to look nationwide at a different model of community involvement and community collaboration. And when you have something like a consent decree, a USP, that's already premised upon an agreement among interested parties, interested residents, it's an opportunity to begin to build that system of greater collaboration and community engagement. And it means committing to that kind of involvement. And that's not easy, but it can be a critical model for the entire country.
Dulce, Tom just emphasized the importance of ensuring that all Latino kids have the chance to succeed at the highest level, not just the average. You have an example of the success of Latino kids in difficult fields, facing extreme obstacles, as most of the DACA kids are. And right here in Arizona, we heard about this program called Falcon Robotics. Tell us about it.
The Falcon Robotics is an after-school program that is dedicated to the science, technology, engineering, and math. This program is in Carhaden High School, inner city school with low-income families that has been disfranchised, and right now its population is over 90% Latino. There's one very successful story that happened in 2004. 4 undocumented students whose second language is English enter an underwater robotics competition. Who would imagine we don't have any seeing here. And they go to California and they enter the university level. And the logic was that if you enter and compete against universities, you be in a high school, and if you lose, well, you won't feel as bad. Why? Because you're expected to be outperformed from universities. They get the first place on this underwater robotics competition, and they're able to beat the best universities in the nation, one of them being MIT. And this is a perfect example of students that have faced the most obstacles that you can find. They are undocumented, they're not wealthy, and in some occasions have been segregated and not been given the opportunity to take calculus, physics, chemistry, that it shows that if you have passionate educators and you give a chance to those individuals that have been disfranchised, they're willing and capable to thrive and be successful. And this is what the Latino community needs and the Latino community wants, an opportunity. We don't want special treatment, but we want to be able to compete in the global economy, not just here in the United States.
Dulce, let me do a follow-up question on that. A lot of people have seen the documentary, I think. They've seen the success of the kids, they want to make it into another movie or whatever. But is there a failure in the follow-up of the success of these kids 4 or 5 years later, where each one of them is at right now?
Not just with them, but the entire program. The program started in 2001, and today is into effect. One of them, Oscar Vasquez, he went into the military. He has an engineering degree. The other 3 students are very successful in their areas, not all of them pursue engineering. But you can see that also the opportunities have taken away. And if the Fair Action had it been, or the DREAM Act would have passed back in 2001, these students will be even more successful today. But we also have seen cases like Angelica Hernandez, who has a master's degree from Stanford University. So this is not an isolated case. You can look at the track record of Falcon Robotics, and you're going to see that each year there's successful students that are going into the STEM fields and other students that are deciding into going into other fields, but they are getting their degree. And right now, 13% of Latinos have college degrees, and we have to change that. And programs like the robotics team is doing that.
Dulce, I'm voting for you for Superintendent of Education in the state of Arizona. Luis, does the decree address the needs of the high-achieving Latinos that we're talking about, and how and what has the progress been? How have you measured that?
It certainly does. There's a whole section of the Unitary Status Plan that talks about advanced learning opportunities, and it very much parallels the kind of thing that Beatriz was talking about, looking to have more participation in AP classes and the classes that lead up to AP classes, the International Baccalaureate Program, dual credit programs between the high schools and colleges, and the dual language programs. We are looking forward to working very closely with the district to really see what happens in terms of putting all of that into place. I want to double back on something that both Dulce and Beatriz referred to, which is the role of educators, because we haven't talked about the role of educators. And central to education and central to the Unitary Status Plan are teachers. And I think it's very important to remind ourselves that professional development, professional support, professional advancement, including of African American and Latino educators, also is part of the plan. And one of the things that we're very focused on is making sure that the depth and breadth and rigor of the professional development that is part of that plan actually gets implemented, because unless you've got a good AP teacher, it doesn't help to have a bunch of AP students in your class. So you want to make sure the two come together. The other part of it is that, again, throughout the plan is the emphasis on having culturally responsive pedagogy. And when Tom talks about the possibility of a model, it is truly an instance in which this district has the opportunity to be way ahead of comparable school districts in the country because of the commitment to culturally responsive pedagogy.
Thank you, Luis. We have discussed a number of critical issues today: immigration, language, education, voting. And as we wind down this event today, I'm going to ask each one of you to identify one critical issue for Arizona and for Latinos. And I'm going to ask you to be brief because we're towards the end of the program. And how is it that you can help facilitate that idea? Let me begin with you, Beatriz.
Thank you, Jose. I think that we should try to initiate dual language programs across the state. 2 years ago, the state of Utah has implemented dual language across statewide in a variety of different languages. But as I said earlier, we know that becoming bilingual is an important achievement. It's an important ability to be able to be in the force, in the labor force, and in the global marketplace. I think it's something that we can do. I think that we do need to prepare teachers to be very good dual language teachers. But again, it brings back the equal value status and importance of the Spanish language. Tucson was the cradle of bilingual education at the beginning. And so Tucson can come back, to be, again, the cradle of bilingual education, of dual language education, and set the tone and the model for the rest of the state.
Superintendent?
I believe in education. I want to close the educational gap of Latinos. And when I say that, yes, I want to see that the majority of Latinos have a bachelor's degree, but I also understand that not everybody has the same opportunities. In today's digital age, everybody has a computer. Most of us have access to the internet, and we can have the initiative of self-education and be in education knowing who is running for office, who's making the decisions that are affecting our children, and making sure that we are always educated.
Francisco?
Yeah, I have two really quick things. Working on the education topic is, Arizona has shortchanged our students for a while now. Recent court decision, over $1 billion haven't been paid out to our local schools. So putting elected officials accountable to ensure that they fund fully our education in our schools here in Arizona, I think that is a priority. The other thing is modernizing our elections and making sure that it's easy to vote, not putting barriers in front of Latinos and other members in our community to ensure that they fully participate in our elections. So, going back to the farce of voter fraud, I think there's been only 5 instances of voter fraud here in Arizona. Some of them have been what we call snowbirds here, voting twice in their home states and here in Arizona. That's the level of voter fraud that we have, 5 over the course of the last 20 years. So if we can improve and modernize our voting elections, we can have a fully participated community here that will have a representative voice in the political process.
Luis, I know you must have like 1,000, but just give me 1 or 2.
Well, obviously, I'm focused on education, but 2 of the aspects of it that I would really stress, and again, some of this has already been adverted to, is to look at asset models rather than deficit models. So much of the effort in the past to address perceived educational deficiencies in Latino children and in African American children has focused on looking at deficits. And instead, we really want to look at assets. It's the dual language programs that stress them. It's the ethnic studies programs that stress them. It's an approach to discipline that stresses it. So focusing on assets and focusing on family involvement. I mean, Tom talked about it, and I think we all, and including in the Tucson School District, and they're trying to do it, I know, really have to go the extra mile to make it possible for parents to know what's going on in their schools and to have a voice in those schools.
Tom?
Jose, 20 years ago in my home state of California, we regrettably enacted something called Proposition 187. And it was, for its time, the most draconian anti-immigrant law ever proposed, much less enacted in the modern era. Now, it was struck down in court, and it never took effect. But it did have an effect on the state of California. And it transformed over succeeding years the state from one that was, at the time, the leader in articulating a voice for exclusion, for nativism, for not integrating. It was a shame in what it was exporting to other states. And there were measures that followed that. But the important point is that California has changed. And a mere 20 years later, and 20 years seems like a long time, but it's only basically how long someone spends in school. So over the course of the school years of a child being born today, the state of California has now become a leader in immigrant integration, has become a leader in cooperative and collaborative interethnic leadership policymaking. It has become a leader, I believe, in trying to ensure that we embrace the diversity, the demographic change that is sweeping the country. I think what has to happen is the state of Arizona has to now take its turn and transform itself from the state that was, unfortunately, a leader in exclusion some 4 years ago. And as with Proposition 187, there have been steps afterwards. But there is an opportunity to address rather than exploit the demographic change, to embrace demographic change, to recognize that all of us, regardless of race, regardless of citizenship, have a common mission. Every retiree in Arizona, present or future, depends upon the success of a Latino workforce in this state and across this country. Because their success in having our economy thrive is what will ensure that those retirees can enjoy a prosperous retirement. Instead of embracing that common mission, we unfortunately have had political leaders in this state and others who have sought to exploit concerns in the back of people's minds about demographic change. But we have an opportunity in this state and across the country to embrace that change, to recognize that we do have a common mission, regardless of race, regardless of citizenship, regardless of immigration status, and recognize that achieving that mission really requires all of us to attend to equal opportunity and civil rights for all. And when we embrace that notion of collaboration, of multi-ethnic leadership, of multi-ethnic collaboration, of multi-ethnic policymaking, we will establish a model for the future. And I'm pleased that we have been here today because Tucson has an opportunity, as I've discussed and as others have echoed, an opportunity to be in the lead for Arizona and have Arizona be in the lead for the nation. I believe that Governor Brewer is going to see the error of her ways, even if she has no opportunity to articulate that publicly. I believe that Governor Pete Wilson, the governor in California who rode Proposition 187 to his reelection, eventually saw the error of his ways, even though he has yet to articulate it, he has yet to acknowledge it. But his state has changed. He's still there. His state prospers. He's still there, but not relevant. That's going to happen in Arizona too. It does mean that some folks won't be relevant, that some folks will be voted out of office. It's already begun to happen. It means, though, that those who remain in leadership have to embrace a different model. And if they refuse to do that, it's the voters that decide who's relevant and who's not. And our opportunity is in November across the country. Our opportunity, whether we are voters or not, to influence the decisions of policymakers to embrace a model of collaboration or a model of division. And that's the small step that we need to take together.
Thank you, Tom. I want to thank each one of the panelists, and maybe for a future for another topic is, Tom, and is more philosophical than anything else. How do we tone down the anger that people have under the so-called freedom of speech when they can stop a bus of kids, undocumented kids, and insult them and basically show their anger? It's adults that I've never seen before covering news. I've never seen this in my life. And how do we stop that?
Well, I think, Jose, your question is a very good one. We do embrace free speech. The Latino community embraces free speech as much or more than any other. I think that is because our community has benefited from those protections, particularly when we recognize that those protections belong to every human being. Not so sure they belong to corporations. That's still to be decided. Obviously, we have some trends in the wrong direction for our Supreme Court, but they certainly belong to every human being. But what's most troubling about what you've described and seeing it occur is what the reaction has been from our leadership. Because the appropriate reaction to a dangerous and a negative exercise of free speech is speech particularly from our leaders that recognize and acknowledge the humanity of the children who are on the bus, that treat them humanely in the policies that are applied to them, that recognize as humans they are entitled to certain rights, and that's what's missing. We are always going to have some small group of folks who are going to seek to stop the bus, but the reaction of our leadership is what matters. And when that is a leadership that embraces community, that embraces humanity, it will be an appropriate reaction in both policy and practice that will ensure that that negative exercise of speech is countered and overwhelmed by impulses that are better reflective of our nation's principles.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks to each one of our participants. Thanks to all of you for joining us here in MALDEF's 2014 Latino State of the State, Arizona. My just closing remarks is that oppression, under any circumstances, is never justified. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today.